Luiz! Luiz!
Sim, senhor.
Quanto eles levaram?
Não sabemos ainda, senhor. Eles levaram as notas usadas e deixaram as notas novas, senhor.
Como é que eles entraram aí?
Eu tô aqui, senhor.
Chamaram a polícia.
The thieves had pulled off an astounding engineering feat. Entirely undetected, they dug an 80-meter-long tunnel, 4 meters below busy downtown streets. Skirting around sewage mains, they'd excavated tons of earth before drilling through a meter of steel-reinforced concrete.
The thieves had shown extraordinary wit and skill to pull off such a deed. That takes a little grim matter.
With only the smallest fragments of evidence to help them, the police chasing the criminals had an equally impossible mission.
The group who had carried the robbery of the century had to be a highly sophisticated gang. And so, it would be very hard for the police to identify and to catch them.
In this film, information from witness testimonies and police interrogations has been used to construct the story of the gang and its mysterious leader. And police investigators tell of the hunt for the money, a search that would be hindered by internal corruption and murder.
There is a lot of corruption in the police. Many times the police knows what the criminal is, but doesn't get to him because the money builds the barrier.
This is a real-life cat-and-mouse story of cops and robbers. A tale of rich and poor, of drugs and of money that travels across Brazil, from the sun-soaked north to the bustling metropolis of the south. A journey that goes into the very darkest heart of the Brazilian underworld. On August the 8th, 2005, employees at the central bank in the Brazilian city of Fortaleza discovered a hole in the bank's vault. Threw in and spectacularly pulled off the world's biggest bank robbery. The police were now in a desperate hunt to track down the thieves. Brazil, the largest country in South America, is perhaps best known for 3 things. Carnival, football, and crime. With one of the highest murder rates in the world and a spiraling narco-traffic problem, Brazil's richness has had it compared to a country in a state of civil war. Although it has the 12th largest economy on Earth, the average person earns less than $250 a month. The vast disparity between rich and poor has created a huge industry of crime, centered on the massive shanty towns known as favelas that circle the large southern cities of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. But it would be in the northeastern coastal city of Fortaleza where thieves would pull off what would quickly become known as the robbery of the century, when they raided the city's central bank in 2005. One of the first men to arrive at the scene of the crime was local police investigator Luis Dantas.
We were just getting ready to start work, and a few minutes before 8, we were called by the police chief Wagner from the federal police.
Juntos fomos.
We went to the central bank and straight to the vaults.
No caixa forte. Realmente
We confirmed that actually a few men whose identities were still unknown through a tunnel had entered the vault at the central bank.
entrado no caixa forte do Banco Central e nós chegamos aí fora.
We learned that the amount taken by the robbers was a little over 164 million reais. I was shocked, but we didn't immediately get inside the tunnel. We waited. Perhaps there might be a bomb. Perhaps.
The police began questioning bank employees. They suspected that the thieves had accomplices at the bank who had tipped them off that there would be such a huge volume of used notes in the vault that weekend. A short while later, armed officers from the National Federal Police arrived. They would take on the dangerous task of exploring the hole. What they would find inside, nobody knew. One of the first things the police saw was that the tunnel was kitted out with electric lighting. the police crept cautiously through the tunnel, news of the record-breaking robbery seeped out onto the streets. Covering the story for the local O Povo newspaper was its award-winning crime team.
In the first few hours, journalists were in a great frenzy, running all over the place. The police didn't know anything either. They hadn't even been inside the tunnel yet. Police initially that it was 200 meters long, right?
That you could walk through the tunnel standing upright.
Standing erect.
There was talk of a body inside the tunnel. It was being said that a corpse had been found inside the tunnel. Many rumors were spreading.
Still below ground, the feds were discovering just how much work had gone into the construction of the tunnel. It was no ordinary bank robber's tunnel. It was 80 meters long and 70 centimeters tall, forming an almost perfect square shape. Much of it was paneled in wood. Fortaleza is built on sand, and the expert criminals had used this wood to stop the tunnel from collapsing. It also helped protect them from water dripping through the soil. They even fitted it with rudimentary air conditioning. Eventually, the police reached the end of the tunnel, where it rose vertically 4 meters to the surface. As they climbed up, the officers had no idea of who or what may still be lying in wait. Back inside the vault, forensic experts were trying to figure out how the thieves had evaded the bank's security systems.
Inside the vault, there were 5 surveillance cameras, and there were some movement sensors placed on the ceiling. They needed to hide from the 2 surveillance cameras that were facing the area. So as soon as they came out of the hole, they had to be careful, and got a wooden pallet and stood it upright in front of the hole, blocking the sightline of the cameras. In this way, they could come and go out of the hole without being seen by the camera. But also, what made things easy was the layout of the vault itself. There was a space between the boxes of money and the wall of approximately 50 centimeters, where people could walk easily, where the cameras couldn't see them, and the sensors wouldn't capture their movement.
The gang had also taken care to avoid detection at the other end of the tunnel. As the police emerged, they discovered the air thick with a white powder, gypsum, a kind of lime dust that can be used in the manufacture of concrete. It had obviously been thrown there deliberately by the departing thieves because the presence of this powder would make fingerprinting impossible. As they edged through the deserted premises, they found digging equipment and samples of artificial turf. The thieves' hideout was a recently vacated commercial building a block away from the central bank. Stepping outside, they discovered that the building purported to house a business called Grama Synthetica, or synthetic lawns. Whoever owned this business could surely lead police to the gang.
We went immediately to the State Chamber of Commerce, looking for the lease of the house. We got a copy of the lease of the property, identified the name of the leaseholder, then we got a copy of his ID document. In his photo, I found it unbelievable. He was wearing a hat. That was the first contact, the first information about Paulo Sérgio we had. Who was this man? Who was the guy in the black hat who had opened the business? A guy whose ID card has his photo stamped on it with a hat on his head. A fake person.
Paulo Sérgio is someone interesting and mysterious because the date he gives as his date of birth, that's on his ID card, is, by some coincidence, the same day on which the robbery was perpetrated.
It's as if the climax of the plan had to be on that day. So that was the sign.
With the discovery of the artificial lawn business, police began questioning neighbors about whether they recognized Paulo Sérgio. Next door to the business is a seedy hotel. Surely the owner must have noticed something going on.
A guy called Paulo Sergio, right? He arrived in a van, parked the van, and the house stayed closed for 5 days. Later, he installed that awning with Grama Synthetica written on it. 15 days later, he started to bring some workers to make synthetic grass here in Fortaleza.
It was only after the robbery was discovered that the hotel owner began to peer more curiously over his neighbor's wall.
In this part of the place, they were keeping the soil in bags. Being very friendly to everyone around here was Paulo Sergio, right? He had brown skin, I don't know, around 180, 189, shaven-headed. Sometimes we had some drinks in the bar on that corner over there. He was kind, polite, that Paulo Sergio. There was one time that he told us that he was doing some work at the central bank. But we didn't suspect anything because there was no mess.
If only the enigmatic Paulo Sergio could be found. Perhaps he could reveal how this extraordinary crime was executed.
Putting a job like this together is a lot about organization. I mean, you got to make everything look legitimate. You got to set things up in the right way from day one. First, you need to find your base, somewhere near your target that you can work out of. Then, while you're kitting out the place for your real purpose, you got to make sure it looks good from the outside, so that any busybodies that come by don't question what you're really up to. Then you have to pick the right team. It's like soccer. There's no point in having 11 strikers. You have to divide the labor in order to create an efficient enterprise. You need the guys we call armadillos, the diggers, right? On a tunneling job, that's pretty obvious. But there's a whole lot more. You need the engineer, a smart cookie who can figure out how to dig a tunnel that's not going to collapse and kill you all. You need a specialist to do the tough jobs. And you need a guy who can front the money. A professional operation like this doesn't run on a shoestring. And you need the guy who's on lookout, watching out for the cops or other threats to the business. You need the guy that captains the team, who can lead the nutjobs and freaks who spend their lives in and out of jail. And finally, you need a guy like me, the front man, the guy who keeps the authorities off your back and makes friends with the neighbors.
The news of the robbery spread like wildfire. A gang who had stolen 164.7 million reais from the central bank had operated for many months under the auspices of a fake business that they had gone to extraordinary lengths to present as real, taking out adverts in the yellow pages, and even handing out promotional baseball caps. And when the time came to steal the money, they had pulled off the robbery without using any weapons.
This is what people were saying in their houses. These men don't deserve to go to jail. They should be congratulated. They did this robbery and nobody was harmed.
The thieves had shown extraordinary wit and skill to pull off such a deed. That's a great matter. You need more than just courage and boldness.
The police's investigations were now twofold. Forensic teams in the vault, tunnel and house looking for pieces of evidence, and officers on the street trying to find out if anyone had heard anything suspicious.
We found somebody who's heard about some men from another state wanting to buy some cars.
Desejosos de comprarem alguns veículos.
And that to pay for those vehicles, they had 1 million reais in cash.
This information would lead the police to realize just how quickly the gang and the money had spread. On August the 6th, 2005, a gang of thieves pulled off the world's biggest bank robbery. Digging an 80-meter tunnel into the vault of the central bank in the Brazilian city of Fortaleza, they got away with nearly $80 million. Immediately, a massive police operation commenced to hunt down the perpetrators of this audacious crime and to recover the stolen millions before they were lost forever. In the building from where the men had dug the tunnel, police struggled to find forensic evidence due to the precautions the gang had taken to prevent fingerprinting. But they had been able to obtain a photograph of the man who had rented the premises. Many neighbors recognized Paulo Sergio, but there were few other leads. However, the police had received a tip-off that there had been a group of men from out of town who had been trying to buy cars with a large amount of cash. Maybe this money could have come from the robbery.
We identified the dealer, where the men went to buy the cars on Saturday, right? We had evidence that proved that the man had been there and bought more than 10 cars.
Critically, the police needed to establish the identity of these wealthy men.
As informações, we discovered that the man who brokered the whole negotiation, right?
Toda essa negociação, tá certo?
Who brokered all the contracts between the gang and the owners of the garage was José Charles.
José Charles was a local businessman who owned a company that specialized in transporting used cars to dealerships across Brazil. Police rushed to his premises, only to discover that he and the cars had left on a transporter around 6 a.m. on the day before the robbery was discovered.
Imediatamente nós fizemos.
Immediately, we contacted all the police forces in the state so as to set up barriers.
Só nas nossas rodovias federais.
We blocked not only the federal highways, but our airports and seaports too.
Nos mares, né?
If the police could find José Charles, maybe he could lead them to the money.
Okay, so you've dug the tunnel. You worked your way around the bank's security system, and you've got in your hand more money than you ever dreamed of. What next? Next, you need a getaway plan. A fail-safe way of getting you and all those millions out of town without anyone noticing. Sounds easy, right? But remember, we're talking about several tons of money here. Over 3 million individual notes. If you stack these notes on top of each other, they'd make a pile nearly 33 kilometers high. That would reach from the Earth into space. And you've got to get it all out in just a few hours without leaving any trace. So you need to make sure that you've got the cars and the vans all lined up with engines running. You've got to make sure you've got decoys in case anyone's following. And it's no use sending just anyone to get the cars. Ideally, you need someone who the feds can't connect to the crime. Not directly, anyway.
For the first few hours of the investigation, the National Federal Police had relied on the local knowledge of the civil police to trace the gang. But the business of arresting suspects would be the responsibility of the feds, led by Police Chief Paulo Sidney.
We got hold of Charles's telephone number and immediately made a call here at the police station to Charles's mobile. Charles was in the state of Minas Gerais. He and the driver were traveling in a trailer with 11 cars.
The police asked José Charles to stop. His driver pulled into the next police highway checkpoint. The feds searched the cars and made an incredible discovery.
The police found in the cars, which were being transported by José Charles, approximately 4.5 million reais. Charles appeared surprised. After the police found the money inside the vehicles, he claimed that he knew nothing about the money, that he was only the owner of the transporter. and that those cars were being taken to be delivered to his clients in the city of São Paulo.
Jose Charles' relatives immediately hired Fortaleza advocate Erbenia Rodriguez to defend him. Erbenia had defended numerous bank robbers and had married a former convict.
José Charles had a clean record. This is the first time someone had pressed charges against him. He had never been involved in any wrongdoings. From the beginning, he has stated not knowing anything about the money that was hidden inside the cars, that he was just traveling with his luxury cars because that client had insisted that he did so.
It will be hard for José Charles to prove that he had nothing to do with this money. Firstly, on Saturday, he and his brother went to buy the vehicles. They took the money in cash to the car dealership. Secondly, he is the owner of the company. Thirdly, José Charles had never gone with the transporter from Fortaleza to São Paulo before.
Jose Charles told the police that the client who had requested his services was called Paulo Sergio, but he insisted that he knew nothing else about the robbery. But on the transporter, there were only 3 of the supposed getaway cars. What had happened to the other 7 cars the thieves had bought? And more importantly, the other 160 million that had been stolen. With Charles professing his innocence, the police turned their attention to the proprietors of the car dealership who had sold the vehicles. They immediately arrested the 2 brothers who owned the firm and seized the 1 million reais they had received for the sale. These men denied any knowledge of the crime and would eventually be released on bail.
They used us. This gang used us. It wasn't something where the person got there and on the same day said, "Here's the money, now give me the cars because I'm in a rush to go." They'd been doing the groundwork for a long time, planning the purchase. We didn't know they were setting us up. We never imagined that it was money from a robbery, from a heist.
Contradicting Jose Charles, the owners of the car dealership claimed they had never met a Paulo Sergio, but said that accompanying Jose Charles in the negotiations were his brother, Marcos Sergio, who police knew had previous convictions for bank robbery, and a third man they described as a smartly dressed businessman from Sao Paulo. The police began looking for evidence to link these suspects with the spectacular tunneling operation. They needed to find somebody who'd actually been inside the house, and quickly, before the rest of the money disappeared without trace. Searching through public records, the police discovered that the house had been due for inspection for mosquitoes several weeks earlier, a legal obligation in Fortaleza, where dengue-carrying mosquitoes cause 70 fatalities each year. If they could find the mosquito inspector, then perhaps they could identify the tunnel diggers.
Posso ajudar? Inspeção da dengue, olha. Nós estamos muito ocupados hoje, o senhor pode voltar outro dia? Mas tem que inspecionar várias casas, mas eu prometo que não vai demorar nem um pouquinho. Paulo, tem um cara da dengue aí fora. E aí? Ele quer entrar aqui embaixo. Ô, pode. Desculpa a demora aí, tá? Boa tarde. É a inspeção da dengue? Fica à vontade, hein? Tá fazendo um jeitinho aí. Aqui é importante. Por aqui, ó. Boa tarde. Boa tarde. Isso. É só um quarto de dormir. Ok. Boa tarde. Isso. Já foi. Já deu. Tem que assinar o documento, certo? Não, no caminho que eu te pago uma cerveja. Vamos lá, eu assino o caminho.
The mosquito inspector told police he had seen men covered in dirt in the house. He recognized Paulo Sergio from his picture, and a man called Antonio Jusifan Alves dos Santos, better known as the German. The German, a convicted bank robber, was also identified by employees at the car garage, who said that he had been there several times with Jose Charles and his bank robber brother. All three men were childhood friends from the same hometown, Boa Viagem, 220 kilometers to the southwest of Fortaleza. The police began searching for the missing millions in the arid drylands of the northeast. 3 days after Charles' arrest, news broke that a man had been seen at a gas station in one of these poor northeastern towns dropping bundles of 50 real notes. In a region where the average daily wage was less than 20 reais, the news had created quite a stir. The gas station was on the road to the German's hometown. The name Boa Viagem means good trip, but police and media visiting the town faced hostility from the locals. Occupants of the town were warned that if they spoke to outsiders, they would be killed. These were not idle death threats. With Brazil's huge murder rate, the disappearance of people is all too common. Informers were unsurprisingly scarce. There may have been money hidden in these arid drylands, but the police were unlikely to receive any clues from the locals. Fortunately, they were about to receive a clue about the Germans' whereabouts from an altogether different source. In Fortaleza, police have been examining surveillance camera footage from the port and airport to see if they could identify any of the suspects leaving town. When they came across a tape from 7th of August, the day before the robbery was discovered, apparently showing a man resembling the German checking into a flight. He was traveling with 6 other men. Their tickets had been paid for with used 50 reais bills. Their destination was the southern metropolis of Sao Paulo. Maybe here the police would finally find the rest of the money. On August the 6th, 2005, a gang of criminals pulled off the world's biggest bank robbery. Digging an 80-meter tunnel beneath the streets of Fortaleza, the men walked away with nearly $80 million. The police had recovered only a small percentage of this, and had arrested only 3 men. The whereabouts of the rest of the gang was unknown, but the clues were pointing to the southern city of Sao Paulo, where a key suspect, known as the German, was believed to have fled. Sao Paulo is the financial powerhouse of Brazil. With an economy larger than the whole of the rest of South America combined, it claims to have more helicopters per capita than anywhere else in the world. On street level, such wealth has seen a burgeoning middle class grow. But the city is not without its problems, as the crime team from the Jornal da Tarde newspaper daily witness.
São Paulo is the city of contrasts. I think there's a middle class of 3 million consumers, people who buy cars, travel by plane, go to shopping centers, bars and restaurants. But there's an army of dispossessed, of, I think, some 10 million people who don't even have a proper place to live.
Skirting the city are miles and miles of shanty towns.
There is a lot of violence, drugs, murder, robbery. Today, actually, we published an article which said that São Paulo has 20 murders a day. This is compared with the war in Iraq, where there are 27 killings a day. Here, there are 20, so it shows you that we don't have a civil war here yet, but we are getting there.
The police believe that the German and other suspected members of the gang had flown to Sao Paulo the day after the robbery, but there was another reason for concentrating police work in the city. It had already been the scene of a well-planned tunnel robbery.
Well, when it was reported that the Banco Central had been robbed using a tunnel, and that the tunnel was a very well-designed mega-tunnel, we in São Paulo were, let's say, very interested, because only last year, a few months before, we had a very similar robbery here.
The police investigator on the Sao Paulo tunnel case was Dr. Barbosa.
As soon as I read about the robbery, I instantly linked it to a case I was investigating. The modus operandi, digging of a tunnel, renting the house to cover up a non-existing business, reminded me of the Transbank case.
But there was one big difference. This gang had used guns and taken hostages.
They went in with heavy weaponry, with a lot of firepower, wearing masks and gloves. They went to great lengths not to leave any trace. But there are always mistakes. So the gang, or part of it, was identified through documents, papers they left behind at the crime sites.
Among the men police identified was the German.
Antônio Josivian Alves dos Santos. His alias is the German. In the underworld, nobody is called by his real name. They all have nicknames.
But the German was not convicted, and the police couldn't get anyone to testify against the suspect.
We had an episode later on. The witnesses were threatened with death because they had identified the subjects. They were so terrified that later they even denied that they were threatened. I think the same individuals might have taken part in both cases. I do think so.
Police investigating the Sao Paulo tunnel crime had never heard of a Paulo Sergio, but they were able to name one other suspect, Moises Teixeira da Silva. One of Moises's many nicknames was the Big Digger.
When we set out to dig that tunnel, we had no idea it would make us famous the world over. After all, we weren't digging for glory, we were tunneling for gold. Some people say this crime is genius, but whoever was the guy who said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration must have been talking about us. For months, we labored beneath the ground. We were working in the most appalling conditions. Do you know how hot it gets in Fortaleza? 40 degrees in the summer. And this digging, well, it wasn't just a question of picking up a spade and getting stuck in. We're talking about a tunnel 80 meters long, 70 centimeters high. A tunnel that skirted around underground cables that could have fried us alive. And sewage pipes that could, well, they could have left us in a real mess. We had to break through earth, through concrete, through steel, and figure out how to get around all the bank's security systems. Digging a tunnel like this, you need guys who know what they're doing. There's no point in taking a novice, no room for anyone on a free ride. You need men with experience, guys that can figure their way around any engineering problems. You need someone that knows when to use the big tools and when to take a more subtle approach. And who can make sure you get to your target without blowing the whole job.
Moises had a string of convictions for robbery and violent crime. Police also believed he had traveled on a plane that had carried the German from Fortaleza to Sao Paulo the day after the central bank robbery. Not only this, but he had been involved in a third tunnel crime. Not far from the Transbank house are the remains of what was once South America's most notorious prison, Carandiru. In 2001, Moises had been serving time there when the biggest jailbreak in Brazilian history took place. The route by which the 108 men escaped was via a tunnel. The police now had one man who linked the three major tunnel crimes in recent Brazilian history: the central bank robbery, the Transbank heist, and the Carandiru jailbreak. But they had no idea where Moises was hiding. The police could now add to the list of possible suspects for the Fortaleza robbery the 107 men who'd escaped with Moises from prison, but the feds would need more solid evidence. Fortunately, their forensic teams were to come up trumps. the first few days after the discovery of the robbery at the central bank, a forensic policeman had come across one substantial piece of evidence. A phone card discarded in the tunnel. They were able to use this phone card to trace its owner and set up wiretaps.
Se liga.
These had led them to a garishly painted house on the outskirts of Fortaleza.
É isso aí. Atenção, é uma Pajero preta com a placa de São Paulo. Isso.
When a car with Sao Paulo license plates turned up, police spotted Davi da Silva, one of Brazil's most notorious bank robbers, at the property. A few moments later, two men emerged from the house, who were already on the list of police suspects.
É isso aí. Vamos lá.
It was time to take action.
Os dois, vamos na cabeça. Encosta, mão na cabeça. Vai. Frente, frente. Direção interna. Anda. Vai. Urgência. Vai.
Inside the house, the police found three more men sorted through bundles of 50 reais notes, all clearly wrapped in central bank bands. The arrest at Mondubim was the police's biggest cash haul yet. They recovered over 12 million reais, and they made 5 arrests. Initially, 3 of these men admitted to digging the tunnel, confessions they later retracted. Among these men was Davi da Silva, who had once been one of Brazil's most wanted bank robbers and was a fugitive from justice. He had sentences against him totaling 80 years. Nonetheless, he took the trouble of hiring a lawyer.
I believe Davi is a character in a sad Brazilian drama. Some son of poor parents who didn't have the opportunity to study, who found himself without options, condemned to a splendid wastefulness, struggling for some form of survival.
Ele é rotulado como sendo o autor.
He's been labeled as the perpetrator of other crimes that he hasn't even committed. Then this has become a wound, a cross for him to bear.
É muito confortável para o aparelho
It's very
policial.
easy for the Brazilian police force to always single out the same suspects for different crimes.
Davi had been caught red-handed with money from the central bank and was one of the men who had initially confessed to being involved in the digging, a confession he had retracted after talking to his lawyer. Following the arrest of Davi, the police learnt the name of another man who had been involved in the robbery. He had been called the boss, but he wasn't Paulo Sergio or the German. His role had been to put up the money to fund the crime.
Running a gang was like running any business. There were countless overheads to be met. From the rent of the commercial premises, to feeding the troops, relocating staff, feeding the troops some more. Then there's the tools and other equipment that had to be bought and replaced when they wore out. Then there's building materials, the plaster, the paint. And then there's protection. I mean, you don't want your team to be suffering any industrial injuries. And you don't want to leave any evidence either. Yes, it all added up. And that's not to mention the electricity bills. That's why you need the money guy.
The operation to rob the central bank was estimated to have cost nearly $1 million reais. The most recent arrests had revealed that the man who financed the robbery, and who would have received many millions in return, was called Fernandinho, or Fernando. Beyond that, the police had no leads. But other people knew exactly who the money guy was. On October the 8th, exactly 2 months after the discovery of the central bank robbery, A 26-year-old man named Luis Fernando Ribeiro traveled with friends to a nightclub in downtown Sao Paulo. As he got out of his car, he was approached by two men. They grabbed him round the throat and bundled him into the back of their car and drove off into the night. The kidnappers knew that this 26-year-old man was the financier of the central bank robbery. A few hours later, the kidnappers contacted Fernando's family demanding several million reais for his release. Afraid of calling the police, the family agreed to pay the ransom. And it was arranged that Fernando's friend, Marcio, would meet the men at a suburban gas station.
I was waiting over here when I noticed that a black car had arrived. Two people got out of the car. One of them asked me where the money was. I said, calm down. I asked him where Fernando was. He told me that Fernando would only come once they had left with the money. It was actually really scary. I stayed here until around 5:30 in the morning, hoping that Fernando would show up. But this was not what happened. The following day, I decided to take the case to the police.
It was only when Marcio contacted the police that they discovered that Fernando was none other than the financier of the central bank robbery. The police immediately sprang into action. In early August 2005, the world's biggest bank robbery took place in the Brazilian city of Fortaleza. A gang of men had dug an 80-meter tunnel beneath the city streets and escaped with nearly $80 million. Police, searching for the robbers, had identified a number of suspects, and 6 men were in prison, awaiting trial. Their information had led police to a man who had financed this spectacular crime, but all they had was a name. The true identity of this man was revealed only following an apparently random kidnapping in Sao Paulo. His name was Luis Fernando Ribeiro, or Fernando for short. The kidnapping investigation was led by Inspector Rui Faraz.
Initially, we had some information that one of the perpetrators of the Banco Central robbery had been kidnapped. We started an investigation still in the hope of finding Fernando alive.
But who was Fernando, and how had he financed the robbery? Fernando was born into a poor family in Capão Redondo, one of the biggest shanty towns in Sao Paulo.
Fernando! Pega essa parada que foi volta na moral. Agora vai!
As a young child, he had been drawn into the drugs trade. Starting running errands for older kids, he'd grown more confident. By the age of 12, it was said that Fernando had committed his first murder. It would not be his last. Through his teenage years, he was employed as an assassin by local drug lords. He was estimated to have killed over 100 people. But Fernando wasn't satisfied with doing the bidding of others. He wanted to be the boss. At the age of 18, he was the king of the slums.
In the region where Fernando lived, he was a Robin Hood figure. He looked after the people who were loyal to him.
Violence had brought Fernando to power, but to maintain it, he needed the trust and support of his community to protect himself from rivals and from the police.
Seu Fernando! Seu Fernando!
Vai deixar que eu resolvo. O que tá acontecendo, irmã?
Seu Fernando, o senhor tem que me ajudar.
O que tá acontecendo?
Olha, o Zeca tá muito mal. E eu conto com o senhor.
Eu vou ajudar o Zeca, pode deixar.
In a country with no welfare state, it's not uncommon for criminal leaders to help local people.
Eu acho que isso aqui resolve.
Muito obrigado, seu Fernando.
Within a partly stable regime, what had tempted Fernando to get involved with the central bank robbery?
I think it was due to ambition. He wanted to expand. He knew that he would be able to gain a much bigger share of the drugs trade in the area, much bigger, if he took part in a crime which would produce the kind of additional cash that the central bank robbery generated.
But for Fernando, getting involved in financing bank robberies had resulted in terrible consequences.
A large part of the money taken from there ended up in Fernando's hands, and other local criminals began to hear about it.
This had led to Fernando being kidnapped in Sao Paulo, and even though a ransom had been paid, there was no sign of his return. Knowing that if they captured Fernando, they could recover up to 25 million reais, the police devoted massive resources to tracking him down. But for the financier of the central bank robbery, it was already too late. "13 days after the kidnapping, his bullet-ridden corpse was found in farm country, several hundred miles from Sao Paulo. The central bank robbery had claimed its first victim. Police worked frantically to discover the identity of the kidnappers, suspecting they would be fellow members of the gang. Several days after the kidnapping, startling information was uncovered. It seemed that Fernando's kidnapping had been carried out by members of the state police.
Fernando's case is a typical one of police corruption. They didn't want to arrest him. They could have arrested him and solved the crime and caught the whole gang. But what did they want? His money. Because they knew there was a lot of money involved.
There is a lot of corruption in the police, perhaps because of the low wages. A policeman on the streets or a detective at the start of his career earns 1,000 reais. This is ridiculous. He can't pay for his rent, his food, school for his kids with that. So he gives up. When the criminal comes along and offers him that 1,000 reais that he earns in a month for one morning's work, for a minute's work, he's going to find it very difficult to resist.
The policemen who had allegedly kidnapped and executed Fernando were arrested by Inspector Ferraz.
Unfortunately, we believe police from this department were involved, and are being tried, and we're waiting, hoping that these corrupt policemen will be convicted and sentenced for their part in this case.
These allegedly corrupt policemen weren't working for themselves, but supposedly for a small group of local criminals who were jealous of the fortune that Fernando had earned from the central bank robbery. But by killing Fernando, these men had stepped on the toes of Brazil's biggest mafia organization, the PCC.
Fernando, he took part of the money that he earned from the drugs trade and gave it to the leaders of the PCC. And because of this, he was highly regarded by the PCC bosses. So the PCC started demanding a response to Fernando's death.
In the eye-for-an-eye culture of the Brazilian underworld, this would mean death for at least one of the men behind Fernando's kidnapping.
He was captured by PCC members inside the slum area, and he was killed in very violent circumstances. They cut off various body parts with an electric saw. His body was burned, and they discarded the corpse. It took several days to identify the remains.
The central bank robbery had now led to at least 2 murders. By the end of October, the feds had recovered less than 12% of the money and failed to capture any of the suspected leaders of the digging. The German and Moises had disappeared in Sao Paulo. Fernando had been killed, allegedly by members of the police, and they still had no clues as to the true identity of the frontman, Paulo Sergio. In spite of this, the federal police were making some progress. The day the robbery was discovered, it was clear that the crime could not have been successfully executed without the gang having inside information about the bank and its vault. But the police had been unsuccessful in identifying who those insiders might be, until they received a tip-off in early October that a former security guard from the bank was spending lots of money and had set up a loan sharking business.
The police today, 80% of the cases are resolved through anonymous denounces.
The investigation is much more a denunciation than a proper investigation.
Someone goes and blows the whistle, hands the information to the police, and then they go in and carry out the scientific procedure.
The police immediately swooped to arrest the former security guard, Diusimar Neves Queiroz, who confessed that he'd been paid 200,000 reais by two men to provide information about the location of the vault in the bank. But Diusimar was a very small fish for the police to catch. Yet only a few weeks later, they received information that another man who had been part of the tunnel escape at the Carandiru prison had been banking large sums of money. The arrest of Pedro José da Cruz, better known as Pedrao, was a significant breakthrough for the federal police. He was the first man they had caught who would confess to having dug the tunnel in Fortaleza. And, in a signed deposition in front of a judge, he outlined exactly how the gang worked.
I was working in São Paulo, working hard for little money, when I first met a man called Davi. This man, this Davi, told me he needed some property renovating. He just bought some apartments up north in Fortaleza, and if I was interested in helping him out, there would be some good money in it.
Fortaleza. E que se eu tivesse interessado em ajudar ele, eu ia ganhar
5,000 reais to keep me on the job. That was a few months' wages. He met me at the airport in Fortaleza and took me to the house at 25 Rua de Março, the Grama Sintética house. A week passed before I realized the real purpose of the renovation. By then, I knew enough about the guys to realize that I knew too much to get out of the job. I was in the morning shift, digging away, for hours in that dark tunnel. To help shuffle the earth out, we cut some large plastic containers in half. Then the trays would be pulled through the tunnel on a pulley system from the main building. To stop the tunnel from caving in, we used wooden joists. 900 of those things, each weighing a kilo. Just bringing them in the house was hard work. Different bosses had different responsibilities. The man calling himself the German did a lot of the measuring. Paulo, he was the administrator, the office manager, would make sure all the paperwork was done, that all the materials we needed were there. Like the special machinery for cutting through the steel-reinforced concrete of the vault. And then there was Fernando. He was the money guy from São Paulo, and he'd show up every 20 days or so. But I never got to see the vault. The day before they broke in, Paulo told me it was time to go and handed me a plane ticket. Apparently there was a chance that there'd be some kind of shootout, and it wasn't necessary to put additional lives at risk. I flew back to São Paulo to await the delivery of my share.
Pedrao's confession was a major breakthrough for the federal police. Not only had he outlined how the remarkable engineering feat of constructing the tunnel had been executed, but he could put several men, who the police believed were key members of the gang, at the scene of the crime, including the fugitives, the German, Moisés, and Davi, who had denied any involvement in the digging. But there was bad news for the police. When the robbery was first discovered, the federal police had hoped it was merely a band of local thieves who'd struck lucky. But for months the media had speculated that the robbery was in fact the work of the PCC, Brazil's most fearsome mafia organization, and the same group that had brutally avenged Fernando's death. Pedrao was linked to a number of crimes perpetrated by the founders of the PCC, crimes which allegedly involved both Davi and Moisés. The conclusion that the central bank robbery had been the brainchild of the mafia, and that many of the stolen millions had fallen into their hands. On August the 6th, 2005, a gang of criminals pulled off the world's biggest bank robbery. Digging an 80-meter tunnel beneath the streets of Fortaleza, the men walked away with nearly $80 million. The scale and skill of the operation had led the police to suspect the involvement of a much wider criminal network.
Here in São Paulo, we have a criminal organization which was formed in prison and which called itself the PCC, or the Premier Command Capital.
The PCC took its name from a football team founded in 1993 in a Sao Paulo jail by a group of inmates. Its off-the-pitch activities began when an opportunity to kill an adversary during a football match sparked off a riot. It was then that the idea had come about to turn the team into a group to campaign for prisoners' rights. This being a union of convicts, they soon turned their attention to activities beyond campaigning. Working like a protection racket, prison members were obliged to pay 50 reais a week. Those who had been released had to contribute 250 reais.
The drug dealers, the bank robbers, give money to the PCC because the PCC controls all the penal of São Paulo. And the safety of these drug dealers and these bank robbers when they're in prison depends on who runs the prison. The fact that someone doesn't contribute could lead to him being killed in prison.
The PCC quickly took control of drug trafficking in Sao Paulo, as well as plotting robberies and kidnappings. Sometimes these crimes were planned by the PCC leaders, other times by lower members, but the PCC would always receive a percentage of the spoils. Journalist Fatima Souza was the first person to reveal the existence of the PCC. She was able to explain how this mafia were able to control activities outside of prison.
The mobile phone is the greatest ally of criminal organizations like the PCC. Because inside their own prisons, with the collaboration of corrupt employees, they can create proper offices and run their business on the outside.
Had this technology been utilized to organize the central bank robbery?
I'm absolutely sure the Fortaleza robbery had the involvement of, not just the involvement, was planned by members of the PCC. Nothing can be done in PCC without the boss's approval. No robbery happens, no kidnapping happens without it.
The gang who had pulled off the robbery at the central bank had been very organized. They'd raised finance to rent houses and buy machinery. They'd skillfully constructed an 18-meter-long tunnel with air conditioning and lighting. They'd moved several tons of money out of Fortaleza without detection, and the leaders of the crime had so far evaded capture. Could they really have done this without the knowledge or support of a larger organization? It seemed unlikely, but there was no concrete proof that the PCC were involved. And the arrested men all denied their connections to this mafia. The only way to find out the truth was to speak to someone who knew this notoriously secret organization from the inside. The founder of the PCC was José Marcio Felicio, also known by his nickname Gelea, or the Big Jelly. Under his command, the PCC had carried out numerous criminal actions and robberies. Gelea was imprisoned in the highest security prison in Brazil, a recently built penitentiary in Sao Paulo State, where he was kept in solitary confinement 24 hours a day. There were many stories about the PCC under Gelea's leadership. The most infamous one was that once during a prison rebellion, one of the leaders had torn out a man's heart, fried it, and eaten it.
It all started due to the suffering that we are going through. We had to unite in order to oppose the injustices from the prison system. Then the movement grew, and it took a very different direction from what was originally intended. I run it like it was a business. I like to be involved and know all that was happening out there, everywhere, in all those prisons. I even had a prison cell with all communication equipments, telephones and things like that. No one's going to rob a bank and not to make a contribution. But what that contribution is depends on the scale of the job. It's not a fixed amount. 2 million, 3 million. It's going to be a good amount, right? You've got to decide what a good amount is out of the robbery. But if you steal 20 million, you're not going to go and give only 500 reais, are you?
Did Gilea know any of the men behind the central bank robbery?
Pedrão. He was at the Carandiru escape, our escape, through a tunnel. It was under my leadership, and the guys were supposed to stay out there, on the streets. But sadly, some were taken prisoner again. I needed people to work out there, to strengthen the organization inside. Pedrão was a very good thief, especially when it came to bank robberies. He was a specialist in digging tunnels. Rarely got it wrong, digging tunnels. Moisés. Moisés. He's a good friend of mine. Moisés is only a member of the PCC. He's not from the highest level, but he's respected because of his involvement in some good robberies. I wouldn't know if he was a good digger, but I've heard that he is. But I don't know if he actually digs the tunnels himself, because he doesn't like hard work, otherwise he wouldn't be a thief in the first place.
Gilea insisted he had no knowledge of the actual robbery. This may have been because in 2002 there had been a fight among PCC members, and Gilea was no longer part of the hierarchy. But with his inside knowledge, maybe he'd shed some light on the true identity of the mysterious Paulo Sergio.
I only know him by name, not personally. You know, I've been out of touch for a while. I hope the police don't catch Paulo Sergio. He doesn't deserve to be in jail. He deserves to enjoy his life out there with all that money. God bless the money, and the person who took it.
After 6 months, the police investigation had reached a dead end. It was impossible to prove the PCC's direct involvement, even though it seemed certain they would have received many millions of the money. The police had failed to arrest any of the suspected leaders of the gang. Moisés and the German were still fugitives from justice, and the true identity of Paulo Sergio remained a mystery. The police had, however, managed to arrest 13 men and were holding them in prison. These included José Charles, the man who had been caught traveling on a car transporter, David, and the 4 other men caught with 12 million reais in a house in Fortaleza, and Pedrão, an alleged PCC member who had confessed to the digging. In addition to this, they had arrested a former security guard who had confessed to helping the gang with technical details about the layout of the bank. It was time for the trial proper to begin. Throughout December and January, witnesses for the prosecution testified before the judge. Many people had spoken to the police, but when it came to appearing publicly in a courtroom, few were willing to speak out, and those that did often became less certain of their testimonies.
People say one thing to the police and then another to the judge. Here, under Brazilian legislation, whenever there is a doubt, this counts towards the defendant.
It's very easy to place responsibility on anyone who happened to have taken part in this robbery. But one also has to ask to what extent the lamentable security arrangements of the central bank contributed to the success of the enterprise.
Security around the courthouse was tight. With hardened criminals like David Silva in the building, the feds were scared that the PCC may stage an attack. During the hearings, all of the defendants and many of the witnesses talked about the criminal mastermind who had put the whole operation together.
Who was this mysterious guy? He arrived in a van and the house stayed closed for 5 days.
I found it unbelievable. He was wearing a hat.
He was kind, polite, that Paulo said.
The first information about Paulo Sergio,
Brown skin, I don't know, around 180, 189. We had some drinks in the bar. On that
who was the guy, the black hat, who had all
There was
the...
one time that he told us that he was doing some work at the central bank. But we didn't suspect anything because...
A guy whose ID card has his photo stamped on it, with a hat on it.
Paulo Sergio, right?
Paulo Sergio is someone interesting and mysterious because the date he gives as his
He was
date of
being
birth
very friendly to everyone around here. That's Paulo
by
Sergio.
some coincidence
of the plan had to be on that list.
the robbery was
The
perpetrated.
first contact, the first information about Paulo Sergio we had.
But incredibly, by the last week of prosecution witness hearings, nobody had yet been able to identify the real Paulo Sergio. Then, on January the 16th, 2006, a new name entered the proceedings, when a witness from the car dealership claimed that he'd seen another man accompanying the German in the negotiation of the purchase of the getaway cars. The man's name was Marcello Marchini. This news created quite a stir. Marchini was a known felon from Sao Paulo, and in 1996 he'd been arrested for $1 million check fraud as a member of a gang that included Moises, though they had both been acquitted. More strikingly, he had been investigated during the inquiry into the Transbank robbery, that allegedly also involved the German and Moises. In that case, police in Sao Paulo alleged Marchini had been the man who did the paperwork, though he had denied any involvement. The pictures of the two men showed a certain resemblance. Could Marcello Marchini be Paulo Sergio? Incredibly, only a couple of days after he'd been identified by a witness in court, Marchini turned up at the proceedings to offer himself for recognition. His attorney, Dr. Isaac Mincello, was already representing 3 other men accused in the case.
I called Marcelo up and asked, have you been here in Fortaleza? There is someone who has recognized you as being here. He said, no, it wasn't me. I said, look, this person is involving you in the central bank case. Said that you were here with one of the most wanted suspects, the German. He said, no, I will come, no problem, I'll be there. I said, then get on a plane and come over here.
The judge agreed to see him the following Tuesday.
Today is the last day that we'll be listening to the witnesses for the prosecution. The atmosphere is very interesting. You feel a bit of pressure on the part of the witnesses because they're very simple people and they're very nervous. Marcello Marchini will be submitted for identification. I've just spoken to him, he's very calm, and he'd like to say to the judge that he hasn't been part of this crime and doesn't know why he's being identified as being a member of the gang. If he was seen with a member of the gang, it wasn't because he was part of the gang, it was just a coincidence.
In front of the judge, the witness could not confirm that Marchini was the man he had seen at the car dealership.
Marcelo put himself at the disposal of the judge, for whatever the case may be. He went there, went in front of the judge, confronted the recognition. The person actually didn't recognize him. He got all confused, so Marcelo was released by the judge, right? In other words, this was a negative identification. My view is that Marcelo is completely clear of the criminal action.
In spite of being released by the judge, the federal police continued to treat Marchini as a suspect.
Marchini, he is indeed being investigated. His name came up during some depositions, but he still hasn't been accused nor denounced by the justice. So at the moment, he's free, and there's no order for his arrest.
As the court adjourned, Paulo Sergio continued to elude police, and the whereabouts of the money was still unknown. By July 2006, the judge in the central bank robbery trial was still considering his verdict. No new names had entered the trial, and the police had still failed to identify the criminal mastermind behind the case, the mysterious Paulo Sergio.
The police are still looking for Paulo Sergio, right? But we haven't reached the person who is Paulo Sergio yet. But I believe that our continued efforts will lead us to him, and we will ultimately catch him.
I don't believe the police will arrest the heads of this crime, just like they didn't in so many other cases. It's been months since the robbery, and still there is no sign of these people.
I personally cannot understand how the police can arrest part of the gang and not identify the rest. And not... even now. Where is the money?
The thieves had stolen nearly 165 million reais, and less than 20 million of this has been recovered to date. So really, who had benefited from the stolen money?
If my clients eventually are convicted, well, it is possible the money they paid me with may have come from the central bank. Honestly, it would not make me feel bad. Not at all. Why? Because it was spectacular. Very well engineered, nobody was killed, nobody got hurt, nobody's life was at stake. They worked really hard for that